we're here for our second session, which is entitled Series of Diaries. In this session, we're going to listen to three people: Amanda Jones from the Churchill Archives Centre, and we'll have two further speakers online: Colin Pooley and Marilyn E from Lancaster University, and Rebecca Rogers from Université de Paris Cité. Now, they're going to talk about series of diaries in the many different ways we can understand the term series, which I think is one of the attraction of this session. Amanda is going to talk about diary writing and war and witness. Colin and Marilyn Pooley are going to talk in a slightly different way, and I must admit, I were quite seduced by the proposition. It's diaries as records of everyday mobility. And finally, Rebecca Rogers is going to talk about a family or family diaries in which all members of families at different points and from different perspectives shared the same diary. So Amanda, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
There we go. Thank you. So my first writer before the war was an actress, a novelist, and the winner of the Carnegie Prize for her children's fiction. Noel Streatfeild was born Christmas Eve, 1895. And by 1939, the income she derived from her own writing had allowed her to purchase a beautiful maisonette in Bolton Street in Mayfair. And you can see here a portrait of her. It would be lovely to think that that was the flat that she'd purchased, but I suspect it can't have been, as you'll find out from later on in my talk. So Noel Streatfeild had started her life in a rectory as her father was a vicar. During the First World War, as a young woman, she started working as a volunteer in the kitchens at a local hospital for wounded soldiers before moving to work in the arsenal, and this was a paid job. She then trained as an actress and toured for several years before turning to writing. Her papers are now held in Newcastle at 7 Stories, which is the National Centre for Children's Books. Streatfeild's diary had a chameleon existence. It began as a personal record prompted, as her biographer Angela Bull says, by the feeling that she was living in historic times. But gradually, public events, butterpooling and the calling up degree, become populated with more personal and more interesting details as her writer's skill enters the narrative. And by 1940, in September, the diary has become a draft for London Under Fire, which was an account she'd hoped to publish. Memory could also be a source of income. For writers living under bombardment, the dislocation of the Blitz seeps into the diary entries, as sleep and peace of mind ebb and flow with the passage of bombing raids. Language becomes halted and sentences are short and broken up by the urgent need to put into words what the writer had experienced before she was interrupted. During the Blitz, Streatfeild worked as an ARP warden, living in her Bolton flat, in between nights in a shelter or on duty. In this diary, she reports feeling anxious. There was too strong a smell of burning and too endless a clanging of fire engines. That was the 8th of September. Later, her diary, which is now in a typed form, records that she saw something very nasty. Her writer's eye observes, "One must get used to seeing things, but would have been glad to have missed that." Master of her language, if not of her feelings, Streatfeild writes about the grimness of aspects of her volunteer work. She reports in early raids, her hands were still shaking as she carried mugs on a tray to waiting shelterers. On the 16th of October, she attended a lunch where she complained about the lack of mobile units to provide hot drinks and food, and a kind benefactor offered to buy her a canteen. Jubilant, she reports to her diary that he put his hand on her arm and asked how much did she need. Streatfeild would later take this canteen to shelters in Deptford, offering tea, cocoa, buns and rolls. Later, with helpers from the WBS, the canteen also served firemen, rescue parties, and demolition squads. And here we see a photograph. I was very privilege to see Stretfield's papers first in William Stretfield's home before they went to the 7 Stories Centre. And he let me have a copy of this photograph. And there she is with the canteen and providing drinks to the little children who, as you can see, are surrounded by damaged buildings. Stretfield loved her Bolton Street apartment, paid for, as I've mentioned, from her own income. She'd filled it, according to her biographer, Angela Bull, with beautiful furniture and exotic carpets that were now within her reach. However, the raids sent her housekeeper, Nellie, to a shelter, and Stretfield, who was afraid of sleeping alone in her flat, went to an underground coal cellar beneath Bath House nearby. But sadly, it eventually came her turn to lose her home. On the 10th to the 11th of May, 1941, the night recorded in Lawrence Ward's London County Council bomb damage maps as the last major attack of the Blitz, Stretfield completed her rounds in Deptford with her canteen before heading home through the raids. She reports feeling wretched with a cold and driving directly to Bath House as raid very fierce. And here we can see the entry. The entry that she has kept here. This is the actual a photograph of the pages that she's written on. So she drove home about midnight, missing a bomb by inches, and then reports bomb dropped very near, and later another which brought down part of the house. Smoke and sparks drifted through. There's a dreamlike quality to this entry, as Stretfield reports how a warden came in to inquire how many people might have been inside. There are illegible words here and there, but she records they could hear the screams of somebody trapped. As the place was on fire and no hope of a fire engine, chance of saving anybody remote. Stretfield, however, helps to move an injured man to the Adelphi dressing station before inviting the stretcher bearers back to her flat for a drink. On arrival, they found place practically demolished, and at daybreak, she returned to a sad scene. My flat is no more. Turning to her friends, Stretfield is comforted but pursued by nightmares. However, in a glorious detail, she records on Monday the 12th at the bottom of this page, had hair washed and bought some makeup. Shortly afterwards, she ordered a new coat from Harrods, and it's only a few nights later that she returns to her rounds at Deptford. But the nightmares still persisted, and she writes about these in her novel for adults, Saplings, published in 1945. Here, Tony, a child who's lost his father and home in a raid, returns to see the ruins and thinks he can hear tapping from beneath the rubble. He's tortured by the thought that this is his father, trapped, and when he returns to school, his nightmares turn to panic attacks, which eventually he cannot hide. At last, he learns the truth and is able to move on. The date of the raid, which killed Tony's father, was the 10th of May, chosen as the date, of course, that Stretfield had lost her own home. The need to write out these feelings was important, and this diary entry contributes to Stretfield's own writing out of her loss. I'm now going to turn to my second writer, who's quite different, but was lived and wrote through the same time. So my second diarist is Mary Borden, later Lady Spears. Borden's diary is held here at the Churchill Archives within the papers of her second husband, Edward Louis Spears. Borden was born on the 15th of May, 1886 in Chicago to wealthy parents. However, as a child, her mother became intensely religious and withdrew from society. And then sadly, her father died suddenly while she was a student at Vassar College. So by the early months of the First World War, Borden was unhappily married to Douglas Turner and had 3 young daughters, including a new baby. And at this point, she got the opportunity and left her home and family to work with the Croix Rouge as a nurse in a typhoid hospital in Calais. After a few months, she left this hospital after a disagreement about how the patients were cared for and established her first mobile military hospital. She ran this through the war with efficiency and care and was awarded both the Croix de Guerre and the Légion d'honneur. And here we can see a portrait of her taken by the same photographer who did the one of Noel Stretfield. And as you can see, there's a lot of character in her face, which I think is a lovely portrait. So by the Second World War, both my writers had established careers and were living in London. Borden begins her diary with the outbreak of war. And for this paper, I'm only going to refer to a few very short extracts, just to give a sense of her talent as a writer and her desire to communicate and leave a record of her memories and experiences. It's not long before her diary reports a planned return to France. As her own fortune had been lost in the Wall Street crash, Borden found a financial sponsor in Lady Hadfield, and from then on, the mobile unit was called the Hadfield-Spears Mobile Military Unit. So with Lady Hadfield's financial assistance and Spears's own connections to General Gamelin, who was the chief of staff for the French Minister of Defense, the response came quickly. Borden is lunching with her husband in the Carlton, and she calls her husband B throughout, after a particularly handsome character in a novel, when General Lalonde, who's the head of the French military mission, approaches their table with news that approval has been granted in principle for her to take her unit to France. This was exciting, and she says, B was thrilled, but she admits, now I'm face to face with the undertaking, I have a feeling of dismay as well as elation. And I found a photograph here of General de Gaulle and Mary Borden with her nurses. I think this might be slightly later because they're at Aldershot at this time, and I think that's after the visit to France that I'm going to talk about. Anyway, within a few months, the Hadfield-Spears unit was in France, and her diary records, I remember charging around the village in snow boots, inspecting drivers' billets. But by April, all our tents are buried in greenery, and patients were limping up and down the paths or lying in the sun. The peaceful image that's painted by Borden contrasts several days later with the confession that I'm frightened, I wasn't ever in the last war. Her diary is a confidant, as she was not in a position to admit aloud that if I sat down, I would weep. As it is, I feel just a little sick all the time. Borden's dispassionate observation is that these deaths are more painful than on the Somme, as one young soldier had a wasted, charming face with 3 days' beard at his death the same morning. At the same time, she calmly listens to the radio at midnight and observes it's very queer to think this road to Calais and Dover is cut by the approaching German armies. And with a senior nurse, she discusses how each of the team will behave in a real crisis. And yet still she admits it's very difficult to picture the fighting. So this diary is a curious mixture of confession and reportage. Her marriage to B, as she calls him, was a complex one, with his secretary Nancy Morris also being his long-term mistress. Borden writes in her diary of their mutual misunderstandings on October the 8th over a telegram. She says, NM, Nancy Morris, is very sensible and loyal to him, but she's there between us, physically so placed that she gives me news of him and sends him news of me. Spears sends telegrams to his wife through the hands of his lover, who is not, of course, a disinterested third party. But in her post-war novel, No. 2 Shovel Street, published in 1949, Borden portrays a dying woman's relationship with her unfaithful husband and with his mistresses. Lady Anne Frobisher is reluctant to consider her own marriage. She says, to dig down into the past, haul up by the hair the bride she had been, and watch her horrid weeping would be curiously indelicate. She pities her unpleasant husband, whose interests were limited to women and politics, that was all. The dying woman reflects that in the intervening years, she had accommodated herself to his views and had adopted for herself as well as for him the code prevailing in their set. It's interesting to speculate whether Borden's highly unlikable and unfaithful fictional peer, Lord Frobisher, has any similarities to her own husband. The last entry I'd like to turn to is the final chronological one relating to the nurses and the unit's separation and the nurses' escape from France. After a night in a derelict chateau at Espinasse, they find a forgotten map in a cowherd's room, which enables them to reach the coast. And a lucky encounter then alerts Borden to the very unwelcome fact that by then, most of the British units had already been disembarked. So the British nurses and Borden leave the unit, making a final dash to the coast. holding a forged ordre de mission to allow them into the town of Bordeaux, they reach the British Embassy, who send them in the care of one Ian Fleming to find a ship. They spend a horrible night at sea waiting for this ship to pick them up in a sardine boat. But at last, Borden did bring her British nurses out of France on the last British transport. She never realized until afterwards quite how close they'd been to being captured by the German army. And here we can see the entry of the diary that I'm talking about now. And she reports that it only dawned on us gradually the excitement there had been about us, as they'd been thought to be lost without trace for the past 2 weeks. And if you come to the reading room this afternoon, I'm hoping to have this entry out so that people can see it for themselves. But both women writers used their diaries to commit their extraordinary lives to paper, probing unwelcome feelings, challenging their own memories, and exposing difficulties within their personal relationships. But at the same time, they leave a rich source of interest for those lucky enough to come to read them. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. So straight away, I'd like Rebecca, if you're here.
Yeah, you see my
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much, Rebecca.
Okay.
So if you're sort of, you get a couple of minutes to get ready.
Okay, I'm ready.
And then you start. Thank you.
Okay, so you do see my screen, yes?
Yes, we do.
Okay, all right. So my presentation today centers around a family archive that was recently deposited in the Archives of Paris, centering around the figure of Josephine Bachellery. Josephine was boarding school headmistress whose career as a teacher spans the years 1825 until the late 1860s, teaching in both the provinces and in Paris. And at mid-century, she was probably the best known female school teacher in France because of her writings on education and her efforts during the Revolution of 1848 to convince the government of the need to establish a higher teacher training institute for women. She's not a forgotten figure of the turbulent 19th century. Historians, such as myself, have noted the feminist tones of her public writings and the importance of her boarding school in the Parisian urban landscape. Now, today, my talk focuses on the private writing practices revealed within the Bachellery archive, particularly the voluminous journal that Josephine began in 1835 and that ends in 1852 with entries written by her husband, Felix, as well as I'm going to be looking at a second diary written by their third daughter in the mid 1850s. My interest in the context of this conference is to tease out the relationship between diary writing, pedagogical practices, and the gendered concern to leave a trace for the future, for family memory, but perhaps as well for history with a capital H. Now, the diaries under consideration are part of an archive containing a range of notebooks that are interrelated. In addition to the 5-volume diary you see at in the forefront of the picture, which is written by both Josephine and Felix, another notebook contains extracts from the journal. In the diary you find in the archive you find notebooks such as those you see on the table, which contain recopied speeches, writings about education, course preparations, responses to writing competitions, notebooks of ephemeris, and the draft of her book Lettres sur l'éducation. So let me give you a little sense of the evolution of its usage and the ways in which Josephine describes it in the early years. To begin with, the volumes themselves vary a bit in size, not a whole lot, a few centimeters, and especially the number of pages per volume, as well as the title that is given to them. The first 2 volumes are clearly indicated as being a diary written for and about the couple's first 2 children. You see that here at the top of the first page of the first volume. Volume 3 adds the name of their son, Leo, who was born in 1837. And then volumes 4 and 5 down below, have no title at all. The number of pages per year vary considerably, ranging from 0 pages in 1850 to 126 pages in 1838. But 2/3 of the journal are focused on the early years between 1835 and 1841. So if one looks at the frequency of diary entrances, you see the graph indicates an initial concern to write very regularly with 144 entries in 1835, and then a gradual falling off, but that is compensated in the years between 1838 and 1841 by lengthier entries, although less frequent. And here you just get a sense of what Josephine's handwriting looks like on a typical double page of the diary. Now, the emphasis from the outset is on chronicling Josephine's daughter's developments. In 1835, when she begins, Isolde is almost 4, Alice is almost 2, and Josephine explains repeatedly that she wants her girls to be able to read these journals later and find a record of their development. This development is physical, moral, intellectual, with special attention paid to these aspects on their birthdays. The early years are filled with stories about their health and their illnesses, their verbal and physical skills, as well as the minutiae of daily life, with the boarding school very much in the background. And one should keep in mind this aspect that the family sleeps, eats, lives in Josephine's working environment, a school. Josephine describes candy and stomach aches, weather and music lessons, visits to neighbors and relatives, pride in her children's intellectual achievements, and punishments when they misbehave. The oft-repeated goal of the diary is to offer the girls and then their son a description of their early lives until the age of their first communion at the age of 12, when Josephine states that they can themselves take over the chronicle of their lives. The diary continues until 1852, at which point Leo, you see, is almost 12. Their third daughter is only 7, and as the dates reveal, they have lost 2 children during this the span of the diary, the first daughter in 44 and a second son in 45. Not surprisingly, given the time span of the diary and the changes in their lives, the diary takes on other purposes. As Josephine's professional life becomes more intense, the journal entries detail far more personal aspirations. After the families move to Paris and their various moves within Paris, Josephine increasingly turns to the diary to describe her efforts to establish herself as one of the most respected institutions for young demoiselles in the capital. And here you see a representation of the final boarding school that she runs. In the process, she copies the speeches she makes at prize-giving ceremonies, letters she receives in response to her public writings. She recounts conflicts with male juries about her teaching qualifications, and she copies speeches delivered at the Société de Philosophie Panacastique in the late 1830s. This society was a primarily male society of pedagogues dedicated to promoting Joseph Jacoto's pedagogy of universal education, and Josephine served for a time as the secretary of this association. Her engagement in this society testifies to the way pedagogical matters played in her professional life, but the diary itself is testimony to how pedagogy and diary writing were deeply intertwined in the Bachellery family life. Now, scholars working on French girls' education, myself included, have long noted the role journal writing played in female educational practices. Mothers, as well as teachers, encouraged their young daughters to write journals, notably as they prepared their first communion. These journals were an opportunity to practice writing, as was mentioned earlier by Helen, and to reflect upon their behavior with teachers and mothers, frequently correcting the diaries. This practice seems to have become more widespread in France in the second half of the century in the wake of the success of Victorine Mognot's Le Journal de Marguerite, which is a fictional diary. The Bachellery diary is somewhat different, however, because it's the parents who do the writing, and it begins well before Mognot's bestseller. In this part of my paper, I want to emphasize the educational dimensions of the Bachellery diary and then consider the youngest daughter's surviving diary kept in the 1850s. The French literary specialist of autobiography and diary writing, Philippe Lejeune, has recently published a stimulating volume about the origins of the personal diary in the second half of the 18th century, and that's the book you see up there in the left-hand corner. His book highlights the variety of writing practices that led to the personal diary, which became more common in the 19th century. Writing practices that French scholars grouped together under the term écrit du fort privé, privé or writings of private life, and these would include accounting books, professional journals, travel, military journals, but also writing notes or letters that people might recopy. Among the different usages he analyzes, he includes the educational diary, notably diaries written by educators and then those written by parents. The Bachellery diary is particularly intriguing since it is both. Josephine begins the diary as a mother to describe the lives of her daughter, but quickly she claims her expertise as an educator, and the journal becomes a witness to her educational vision, as well as an object that participates in the education of her children. Josephine is not just a mother and a teacher by profession. She is also an adept of Joseph Jacoto's emancipatory pedagogy. Jacotot was a French teacher in the early 19th century who briefly acquired fame in educational circles in Belgium, France, and England as well for his system of universal teaching. This method involved a process of memorization, repetition, and justification that theoretically required relatively knowledge for the teacher, who simply accompanied the student in his or her learning process. He argued for the overall equality of intelligences, and his method appealed to women teachers in particular who had few opportunities for formal training. Josephine encountered Jacotot's method in the late 1820s, and her move to Paris, it was in part to be able to develop her method with other adepts of this system. In the late 1830s, when Jacotot himself moves to Paris, he becomes a frequent visitor to her school, and she takes her students and her daughters to visit his home. She uses the diary then to relate her children's intellectual progression using his method to learn to read and write, to play the piano, and later to learn history or geography lessons. The journal then offers an exceptional vantage point into the quotidian practices of a Jacotist pedagogue. Her children all learn to read and write by memorizing the beginning of Fénelon's 1699 educational treatise, The Adventures of Télémaque. Here we see in the top excerpt from the diary that Isole, the oldest daughter, is tracing the capital C of Calypso, which is the first word in Télémaque, which she then memorizes and learns to read and write. More classically, Josephine also has her daughters at times dictate the content of the journal, or as they get older, write themselves in the journal, as you see in the modern excerpt where Isole is age 5. In this way, the journal not only details their progress, but also actively engages them in the process of writing their lives. This writing has a specifically pedagogic purpose. Josephine wants her daughters to learn to scrutinize their lives and their actions through the act of keeping a journal. Initially, her own writing is a role model, but she also puts her vision into action, encouraging her children to keep their own diary. So let me turn now to the second diary in the archive, which is that of their third daughter, 9-year-old Isole, who will later be called Catherine, speaks about, this is the front cover, and it was clearly part of a series of texts. And here, Isole Catherine speaks about her religious education, notes the grades her mother gives her in monthly report cards, copies down her mother's criticism, and leaves multiple examples of the way this writing is integrated into an educational program. You see on the next page, which is not wanting to continue. Whoops. On the next page is that her mother has copied down her report card. And you see that Isole also copies down criticisms that her mother makes of her, so it's her mother's voice, but she's copying down this complaint about her poor behavior. In January 1856, she notes that up until then, she's copied her journal after a first draft that her mother corrects, but her mother has now decided that since she makes fewer mistakes, she can now write directly. And like her mother's journal, the pedagogical dimension of the journal mingles with a more newsy chronicle of the people she sees, play dates, illnesses, etc. But the journal bears clearly the mark of the educational goal of this practice. And in December, she notes that in a few years, she will treasure these pages where she will find in every line the proof of her parents' unbelievable affection. It's impossible to say whether she continued her diary writing afterwards, but the fact the notebook was saved alongside Josephine and Felix's diary is a sign that she and her descendants valued these writings enough to keep them in the family. So let me conclude by a few remarks about how these two diaries have shifted my understanding of the gendered practice of diary writing in the 19th century and its role in girls' education. To begin with, the two diaries bring to the analytic foreground the family more than the individual. Unlike the late 19th century adolescent girls' diaries with which I'd been more familiar, these two speak powerfully to the familial dynamic that explains, no doubt in part, their preservation. Josephine and then Felix sought to preserve traces of their children's early lives and then of their experiences during a particularly tumultuous period of their lives, tumultuous in personal, professional, and political terms, as they both supported the Republican movement of the 1840s. Contrary to my expectations when I first found the journal, it does little to shed light on Josephine's burgeoning feminist consciousness, but it does bring home how important the family and her husband were in allowing her to become a public voice. It reveals as well the multiple reasons that led this 19th century woman to attempt to chronicle her everyday life. Finally, it highlights how important the everyday and the experience of mothering were to her practice of teaching. The private and the professional were inextricably intertwined. A second series of remarks concerns the husband behind the wife in an interesting inversion of our standard interpretations of public and private spheres in the 19th century. Josephine is the motor behind both diaries, but Felix increasingly takes over the writing of the family chronicle. Initially, Josephine makes clear that she invites him into the journal so that he can participate more fully in his paternal role. But he writes far more regularly, beginning in 1844, when their eldest daughter dies, and finally, and particularly in the final revolutionary years, when Josephine is particularly active, publishing articles in a book while also expanding her school. Together, then, they sought to leave a mark that would testify to their engagement in a pedagogical project that was also a family project and an effort through education to create a more just society. Bachellery's public writing clearly reflects that latter goal, while the diary chronicles the extent to which the family, its demands, and its supports allowed or weighed on this public engagement. Its longevity and its preservation, I think, encourage us to consider how diary writing and family dynamics participated then in the creation of women's public voices. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Rebecca should have been here in person, but she got COVID recently, so she stayed home. Okay, so can we go back to Colin and Marilyn?
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And apologies for what went wrong before. I still haven't worked it out. And by the way, we're both here, but using the same computer, but with limited time, I'll do the talking. So what I'm going to do in this talk is basically two things. First of all, briefly give an explanation of what our project was, and secondly, to then go on to talk about some of the things that we feel that we've learned about the nature and diversity of diaries by looking at a very large number of them, but focused on a particular aspect. So the project was about everyday mobility. And by that, I mean the journeys we all make every day to school, to work, to shop, to see friends, to socialize. We know a lot about everyday mobility in the present. We actually know very little about everyday mobility in the past, because those sorts of journeys were never formally recorded in any way. The work that's done today is done usually through in-depth interviews and accompanied journeys. There's a large contemporary mobility theory around that. What I wanted to do was to look at diaries to try to uncover some aspects of everyday mobility in the past as it was recorded by people, and then to relate it back to contemporary mobility theories. We've looked between us at 60 sets of diaries and a small amount of other life writing, but the life writing we've used has all obviously been copied up from diaries. By and large, autobiographies don't provide the details that we need. Our diaries have come from a wide range of sources, though obviously there are many others we could have used. The Bishopsgate Institute archive that Polly was talking about has been one important source, Edward Halder, our diary collection in Wigan, and a wide range of other local archives, and also quite a lot from personal collections, personal contacts that I've made over a large number of years, particularly from a former project on residential migration in the past. Our diaries are very wide ranging. The youngest is 13, the oldest is 89. We have men and women. As you'd expect, the very poor are underrepresented, but otherwise we cover a wide range of social classes and groups. In terms of detail, as I'll say a bit more about later, young female diaries tend to provide the most detail, but a lot of male diaries also provide important information. And the key point to make is that all of our diarists were people who had no public profile at the time. They were very ordinary people. None of their diaries were intended for publication. They're all unpublished in their original form. And the diaries we read are handwritten in archives, often very difficult to read. Many of the diaries take different forms, some for a year or less, others for most of a lifetime. The longest one we've got is for a lady who began writing a diary in 13 and stopped shortly before she died in her 90s. And she wrote a diary every year. I'll just briefly say what were the key conclusions from the project in terms of looking at mobility before I go on to looking more specifically at the diaries themselves. The first thing that we'd emphasize is that personal diaries certainly do provide us with insights into past mobility, and they demonstrate the way in which basically everybody, men and women of all ages and all social classes, moved around a lot, but with a high degree of variability in how they traveled and why they traveled. That's quite important because there's often quite a lot of assumption, particularly in the later 19th century, accounts of the way in which women were constrained. Our female diaries were highly mobile by a wide range of different forms of mobility. It's allowed us to explore the ways in which travelers responded to changes in transport technologies. You know, we're looking over 2 centuries, from the early 19th century to the late 20th century, massive changes in transport technology. How did people react to that and adjust to that? It also allows us to analyze the way in which mobility is contextualized and situated within particular family structures, life course, social class, gender relations, location, and the journey purpose. So that, for instance, where someone lived made a huge difference to how they traveled simply because of the modes that were available. And then lastly, we're able to link this across to contemporary mobility theories and to argue I think very succinctly that mobility theories today are just as relevant to the past as they are to the present. If you're interested in following this up more, we've written a number of papers and we have a book manuscript with publishers Palgrave at the moment, which hopefully will emerge in due course. And just a couple of illustrations. Here are 2 short extracts from our diaries, just to illustrate the nature and complexity of some of the journeys that were made. John Lee, young man, 18-year-old, living in northeast Lancashire, a journey down to Liverpool, encounters what he calls new American railway carriages, first trams in Britain, in Birkenhead. And then the second one, Diary of Ida Berry, living in South Manchester in the first decade of the 20th century, then age 21, traveled widely around South Manchester. And what comes out from many of her entries is the way in which she and her family were able to switch between different transport modes very seamlessly as they moved around South Manchester, from walking to buses, to cabs, to trains, without any difficulty at all. And apparently without looking at timetables or worrying about it, that there was always transport there. So to move on to the diaries themselves, I want to focus on 5 themes, which are in some senses all interrelated. First of all, starting and stopping. Why do people start writing a diary? Why do they stop? How life course changes altered the nature and writing of diaries. the way in which some of the things that were in diaries varied by age and gender, and related to that, variations in content and style. What were the things that people wrote about? What were the things that they didn't write about? And then finally, again, link back to that, what are the things that are not said? Those are some of the issues I'd like to talk about. So first of all, starting and stopping. Most of the time we don't know why someone starts a diary, and we don't know why they stop. And of course, it may simply be a matter of survival. Which diaries survive, which diaries get put in an archive or made available for the public to view. So there is a certain randomness inevitably. But occasionally you get a clue. So Elizabeth Lee writes at the start of the second diary that we have, that she took to write a diary. So she began last year and then begins to copy up some of it into her second diary. We've seen the first diary. She says no explanation in that diary about why she starts to write it. She actually gives the explanation in her second diary. And as I think one of the earlier speakers mentioned, one of the other reasons why I think diary writing began often at the age of a relatively young age, because they were encouraged to do so. And one of the diarists that we've used, I was able to interview shortly before she died, and she was able to tell me in the interview that the reason she began writing her diary at 13 was that she was about to leave school. She left school just before her 14th birthday. And she said that the teacher encouraged her to write a diary to help her to continue to improve her handwriting. And she started writing a diary when she was 13, and then she wrote a diary every day of her life, right until she died in 1989. In terms of stopping, we have a couple of diarists where it's kind of obvious why they stopped, because the end coincides with their death or extreme illness. But again, more often than not, we don't know precisely why they stopped. Although the diary of Gillian Caldwell, living in Cumbria, in a remote valley in Cumbria in the 1950s, gives a clue to the way in which she gradually found writing a diary to be really something that she wasn't relevant to her life anymore. And she's in her just into her 20s, and she is increasingly writing that her diary is something that she is neglecting. And then the final entry is on her 21st birthday. And it's almost as though that's the point at which she becomes an adult and the diary is no longer necessary. She's nearly always happy, so there's even no point in commenting on it, and she's moving into an adult phase of her life. If life course changes occur, then there can often be quite significant shifts in the way in which the diary is constructed or in the run of the diary. So the diarist Emma Blake, her husband, who she's nursing, he dies in 1903. Then there's no diary at all for 1904. Then the series picks up again. And it's almost as though that point of her life, a traumatic event, meant that she stopped recording what she was doing. But from 1904, she carries on pretty much as she had done before. Verena Pettyfather's diaries, 1907 to 39, long run of diaries relatively, but there were no diaries for 4 years after the birth of her first child. So motherhood and just simply being busy prevents diary writing. So often there are gaps caused by particular events of life course changes. But events of life course change can also alter the way in which a diary is written and the content of it. So the diary of Annie Rudolph, for instance, was a diary which provides a lot of information about everyday life. She was very busy, but her mother dies in 1923. It's a Jewish family. She's required to go into a year's mourning. And now, although she keeps writing her diary, the form of it, the nature of it, changes completely. In terms of differences between older and younger people, between men and women, as I said already, young women tend to write the most detailed entries. And by and large, men, as in the first two extracts here, often wrote quite short factual entries. They related to what they did. There's information there, definitely information that we can use, but there's a limited detail. Female entries tend to be much longer, as in these two examples from the diaries of Betty Charnley, and from Elizabeth Lee, that provide quite a lot of information about what they were doing, where they went, and how they experienced their journeys. And following on from that, most of the diaries provide us with limited sense of knowledge of how people were feeling about the journeys. It's only very rarely that we get a sense of emotion or fear. And these are just two examples from the diary of Annie Rudolph and Gillian Caldwell, where they are relating something which occurs during a journey or in the context of a journey, which clearly disturbed them. But those sorts of entries are extremely rare. For the most part, the entries are unemotional, they're reasonably factual, they provide an account of what's going on, but they don't draw out the inner person by and large in most of the diaries that we've looked at. And then finally, what may be unsaid. Of course, we have no idea what's unsaid. Many things were unsaid. But I would argue that the lack of emotion is one of the things that is most visibly missing. It's not missing from all. And here I'm just comparing two entries relating to a family death. So the first is Elizabeth Lee, whose baby brother is ill and then dies. And her account clearly makes it very clear that this was an emotional event for her. She was very upset by it and writes about it in quite an emotional way. In contrast, we see here the entry of Betty Charnley, whose mother died. And this is the whole entry for the day that her mother died. And as was typical of almost all Betty's diary entries, it's a very simple, factual account. So she says what happens, but she carries on with a normal life. She did the washing after tea, carries on with her normal jobs as always, and she always records the weather at the end of her daily diary entry, and somewhat incongruously at the end of the day her mother dies, she writes a smashing day. She's referring to the weather, but it seems a very strange thing to write. So in summary, Annie Rudolph, extract from her diary, in summary, I think what we would say is there is no such thing as a typical diary. We've read a lot of diaries. They're all different. They all reflect the personality, character, and situation and context of the diary writer. The context and the content and the form can change dramatically over time if we've got a long series of diaries. But what we can also say quite clearly is that diaries do provide us with an enormous amount of detail, not just about mobility, which is what was the main focus of our work, but about many other aspects of personal individual lives, which otherwise remain completely hidden from view. So thank you very much for your attention, and apologies once again for messing up the slides the first time round.
Thank you very much for thank you very much to the three speakers.